headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Anyway, we need to talk about one of the other big items this week that got a bit of coverage, but I think under normal circumstances would have much more coverage, and that is the cost to UK taxpayers at a time when money is tight of accommodating the illegal asylum seekers here in the UK, because the Home Office revealed initially that it was costing about 1.2 million a day on hotel accommodation only, and then corrected that within 48 hours, saying that actually, terribly sorry, it's nearer £5 million per single day, just the cost of hotel accommodation only. That's not including the long-term accommodation. And then you've got, of course, the issue of, well, how much is it going to cost this year as the numbers are forecast to increase yet again? Well, here to discuss this with me further, my second guest today is Stephen Wolfe, who's the director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity. I'm not sure there's much economic prosperity being felt at the moment. Stephen, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining me on Ties Talk. So we've had these numbers from the Home Office this week, just in respect of the cost of hotel accommodation. What other costs does one need to sort of add on top of that to try and understand the true cost of accommodating asylum seekers, those crossing the English Channel illegally every week, every day, every month, that we should be taking into account?
Richard, you're quite right. These accommodation costs are truly astounding and astronomical, but they only play a part in the overall cost. And before we delve into the housing costs, because those numbers that the government have given actually underestimate the total cost of housing for the year, your kind of listeners should understand that the moment that a boat is placed into the waters of Calais, or someone gets onto a lorry or a plane, begins the cost to the British taxpayer. First of all, you have the costs of the three frigates and the RLNI that are looking after those boats as they come across and bring them in. Once they arrive, they're put into assessment centres, and those assessment centres, you would then have asylum application initial assessments followed by health assessments. Then there's transport to what's called the initial accommodation, the short-term accommodation, where they're assessed for longer-term accommodation. At that process, the asylum application kicks in, and so you get legal aid. But in addition to that, you get advice from a myriad. We've counted so far 137 charities across the country that are getting money from local authorities and national government contracts that give advice to them. Then, of course, there's the health costs and the dental costs. Furthermore, you then get court costs as they approach the application process for asylum, leading into appeals, and then appeals on the appeals, and sometimes going to judicial review costs. Then you have policing costs that relate to sometimes criminal offences that are committed by asylum applicants or those going disappearing. As I can say, Richard, you look at all of those, and to the economy as a whole, we're estimating this could be up to between 2 and 4 billion a year.
And that's essentially the cost currently.
Yes.
Now, the forecast for potential crossings over the Channel this year, I mean, I think the Home Office base case is over 60,000. I think I read that their worst case is some 90,000. We know that in January alone, the number of crossings was 6 times January last year. So, in a sense, we're looking at a huge increase on last year and a multiplier of 2020 and 19. So this cost is going to increase enormously.
Absolutely.
But of course, and the extraordinary thing from these numbers you're talking about, Stephen, is that actually people on this side of the Channel are making a great deal more money than the vile, hideous people traffickers in France.
Yes, I mean, there are huge sums of money involved in this. So let me give you one example we did whilst researching the housing contract. The housing contract, that is a 10-year contract over with 3 companies that are involved, Clear Springs, Mears and Serco. they get 4.5 billion. That's excluding the additional costs you've talked about this morning, which is the 4.7 million a day to house those in hotels. Within that contract, there was a migrant charity that gets £100 million for answering and advising asylum applicants on the process of housing and legal aid. Then, of course, the legal aid budget, which is, I have to admit, in our research, is incredibly opaque. The best that we're getting is 11 million a year, but our estimates, we think, are going to be double that. So the lawyers are getting a nice chunk of money from this too. So you can see it. Big corporates, charities, and lawyers all getting a chunk of a pie that is enormous from our taxpayers.
So I talked earlier in the show about trust in big business, in particular in big pharma, but it feels to me that there's another big question, which is trust in some of the lawyers, the human rights industry, and of course the big outsourcers, the Mirs, the Sercos that you've mentioned, who are making huge sums. So the reality is, from what you're saying and from what I'm instinctively feeling, that the vested interests here in the UK are making so much money that actually not only do they want this to continue, but if the numbers increase, then happy days for them.
Well, of course, it's in their interests if they want to keep a job in the times which we have now, which are very hard, to support something that they actually perhaps enjoy doing or certainly receive a large sum of money for. But it's not in an interest of an immigration lawyer to have no asylum applications, is there? Because at the end of the day, they would have to go and try and find another area of law in which to make some money. If there were no asylum applications going through, then there certainly wouldn't be any of these charities.
And it's important,
So,
I guess, Stephen, it's important to differentiate between the legal, lawful asylum seekers, for example, those that quite properly we've welcomed from Afghanistan, who helped us in Afghanistan as translators and the like, and asylum seekers, lawful asylum seekers under the Syria programme. There's a difference between those and those who've come here illegally across the channel, isn't there?
I think there is. And of course, one also has to look that we do have international responsibilities. And the bigger aspect about this is that because we are signatories to the United Nations Convention on Refugees and we have our human rights acts and laws that connect with that, we do have to comply with that. And as a consequence of that, we do have to make assessments of whether people are genuine asylum seekers and therefore entitled to remain here, and those who are not. My process about where I come from, Richard, is I'm just giving the numbers out and the stats so that people can make those assessments for themselves and whether they feel it's justifiable. And also a matter of fact issue. The matter of fact is that, yes, of course, those people who are helping the asylum applicants will do so genuinely out of the goodness of their heart. Most of them will do. And some will be certainly interested in keeping their jobs as a consequence of that. They're both tied together. I think really what we have to ask ourselves as a nation is, when you look at the numbers coming through and the estimates for this year, you're quite right, between 66,000 for our low end and 105,000 at the top end. And you're already paying 1.75 billion extra on top of the 400 million a year for housing. So that's 2.1 billion on housing. That's going to go up even more in terms of a housing cost.
I mean, these numbers are absolutely huge at a time, of course, when British taxpayers, households up and down the country are finding enormous increases in energy bills, in council tax bills, in national insurance. In a sense, I think people will be increasingly frustrated, irritated and angry at these rising costs as they're having to pay so much more themselves.
Well, of course they do. And there's always going to be the arguments, and we can see it on both sides, that if the government can lose billions in track and trace, or those who've defrauded the system during COVID, then these numbers are minuscule. But the reality is, in this country, we have pensioners who will be suffering from poverty, or fuel poverty. We'll be having over 250,000 people who are living in short-term accommodation and hotels and bedsits, who are born and live here. The demand that's going to be pressed upon approximately about 120 councils that participate in the dispersion scheme of asylum applicants. As soon as someone has an asylum application granted, it then falls upon them either to find private accommodation or be landed with the local authorities. Of course, that then has an impact on those who are poor in those areas too.
And of course, that forces up rents on private accommodation and reduces the available supply, doesn't it? So it's
absolutely.
It's a never-ending circle. But what we do know, and I know you're doing ongoing work on these costs, what we do know is the costs are going up, the numbers are going up at a time when actually households are really feeling the pinch. Stephen, we'll come back to that as you complete more research on costs. Thank you so much for that. That's Stephen Wolfe, the Director of the Centre for Migration and Economic Prosperity.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.